Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Grace of a Military Child and Life podcast. Military families are not like your traditional family. They are strong, brave, resilient, and some of the most incredible people I know. My name is Gracie, a U.S. Army brat, and I am your host. I am honored to be able to give military family members like myself a place for them to share their stories and experiences in the military life. Stay tuned for this week's guest. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of Grace of a Military Child and Life. Today, I'm here with Michelle, who is not only a former Army spouse, but also a Gold Star spouse. So, Michelle, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Yeah. So can you kind of give us an overview? You've lived the life of a military spouse that no military spouse wants to live. I give you so much applause for everything that you've done and sacrificed for us. And thank you for that. But what has your journey been like?
I think each of us has a very unique journey. For me, I came from a family where there was no military background whatsoever. And my husband, his whole family background was military. So he was raised as a military brat. And so we got married and he was not in the military. He joined right after we got married. Well, not right after, a couple years after, and we had 2 kids by then. So it went from, us being married and kind of just doing the civilian life to suddenly we're thrown into military bases and me having to catch up and learn everything all at once. And having 2 little kids. So you are very busy. And one thing you learn as a military spouse pretty quick is that your husband or whoever, if it's your wife, your spouse is busy. They're in the military, they're doing training, they're gone a lot. And so you're trying to raise these 2 little kids and you're, say, in a new town because you've PCSed and you're trying to learn the ins and outs of everything. So it can be very challenging and lonely at times because you have to be very strong and you don't have as much time to make friends. And we always lived off base, so that made it more complicated.
Right.
And so you're just you feel like you're constantly trying to catch up. And then, of course, for me, my husband decided he wanted to become a Green Beret. So that meant he was home even, half as much as the average soldier. So he ended up going to SFAS, which is Special Forces Soldier Selection, essentially. And so he was gone for a couple months for that. And then once he was selected, he was gone, consistently for the next 2.5 years for that training, all the time. And then once he was actually on a team, they would deploy for 6-month stints and then basically train or go to schools like Ranger School, which were typically 3-month stints where we hardly spoke. So really, I only saw my husband 3 months a year on average. So most of my time as a military spouse was, I would say alone, but I mean alone without my husband. Most of the time was raising kids and having a kid on the spectrum. I was pretty busy just trying to, of course, I wanted to have a job, but with him, it was a lot of time learning about autism. And every time we moved, it was dealing with the new school systems, trying to figure out the rules in that state, working with the laws of, Americans with Disability Act and all of those different things to basically try and support my kid. And then trying to find things like MOPS or any like mom groups, just so I could have a social life. And then, of course, because your husband is gone so much, all of your holidays. So my whole family was West Coast and we were on the East Coast because everyone for Green Berets and Special Forces, they typically train on the East Coast. So we were in North Carolina. And so it became every holiday we were with friends. So we did, Thanksgiving, Christmas, everything was with friends. And so it was really important for me to make those connections through MOPS or any other group so that no matter what Brian's schedule was, I had people to have my kids, for me and for my kids to kind of have family. It was the family we created, of course, but we spent holidays with pretty much friends. And a lot of them were military, a lot of them weren't. It just kind of depended. Because we didn't typically live on base, we always lived off base. A lot of those friends were either former military or civilian, which made it nice because we could blend into the community a little better. So,
well, and those friends become family. Like you just said, you create your own family. Most of the time, you don't necessarily have your family, your direct family around you. And it's not always easy to hop on a flight or, pack the car, especially with young ones and, your husband not being there. So you're really forced to step into those things of, okay, well, let's make this work however we can.
oh yeah. And, any little thing comes up. And I mean, like you said, families on one side of the country, you're on the other. So you also need people to step in like, oh, hey, I've got this emergency going with this kid. And you need kind of a collection of people that you call and say, hey, can you run over real quick? Or, hey, my husband's home for a couple nights and we want to go on a date night. Like, would you mind come watching my kids and I'll swap out and watch your kids next week or whatever, just because you don't have your parents or other family members to kind of pick up that slack and help you out. I mean, there is no one, it's all on you. And so you have to figure out how to make that community. So it'll help you and you can help them.
Yeah. And those are, in the military community, we say it kind of jokingly, but it's more serious than a lot of people, take it. But it's that thing of, will you be my emergency contact? Because, you don't have anyone around you. And it's rare that you get stationed with someone that you were stationed with previously. You talk about, the Green Beret and Special Forces community. And yes, those are much smaller communities. And, there may be a higher likelihood that you get stationed with someone that you knew. But still, like, what are the chances? It's still rare. So you have to really kind of put yourself out there as soon as you get there, find those groups and say, okay, let's make this work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and like in my situation, of course, you never think it's going to happen to you, but the ultimate emergency, your husband or your spouse is killed overseas or in an accident, which my husband was killed overseas. You don't realize that you will ever need those people or that you will need to have an emergency contact on that level, right? Because it's never going to happen to you until it does. And I remember after I had the knock on the door and the casualty assistance officers were sitting there, or the CNOs, the notification officers, they were sitting there basically informing me, which never would have occurred to me before, that they could not leave me alone until I had somebody there with me. And I remember them asking me, like, who do you have? And I was like, no one. Like, I don't have anyone. Everybody's on the West Coast. And then I realized, no, wait, I've got this whole group of friends. And so, I ended up calling one of them and, you've got to get here because something happened and I couldn't even figure like how to put it yet.
Yeah,
they're there. And yeah. And so, they end up like having those communities and those roots kind of put down, and those friendships really, really matter when the worst situations hit. And you may never have it happen, which most people don't, but if they do, it's a huge relief in that moment to realize like, oh, I do have people and I've built that I've built that foundation here. So
absolutely. And if you don't mind sharing, can you take us kind of back to that day that you did get the notification and what that was like for you?
Yeah. So my husband, like I said, he was a Green Beret. He was working, typically, him and his team would spend 6 months a year in Niger, Africa. So I knew he was working in a fairly remote area. Of course, he would lie to me and tell me it was very safe. I would find out later that, that was a lie.
I think everyone does that.
Yeah, I think I felt better just believing him than questioning it, But he had left August 20, I think it was 26th or 28th, right around there. And I remember dropping him off at the regional airport. They would just fly those guys out on regional planes. And it just felt different. And he was killed, I think, was it about 5 or 6 weeks later, October 4th. And so it was a lot harder that time. So there was a lot of premonition, a lot of tension that built up over time. Typically with Green Berets, you don't hear from them as much as you would say if you were deployed in Afghanistan or Iraq. There's these big bases built up, right? And there's all this infrastructure, so you can FaceTime. There's internet. That's not how it worked in Africa. Brian would leave, and I might not hear from him just because the transition over there, and then having to get new SD cards and everything for their phones, and the lack of infrastructure. And tell me if I'm talking too much, but the lack of infrastructure
go for
on
it.
bases in places like Africa and more remote regions, I might not hear from him for 3 to 4 weeks once he deployed. So, and even then I might talk to him once every few days if I was lucky, and he could only call between certain hours. And by then the kids were usually in bed. Like, I think that trip, he only talked to them twice before he was killed. And so, yeah, being gone 6 weeks, it was like we had just established communication and started speaking. And so I knew that he was out on a mission, and it was supposed to be a 1-day mission. And so after he wasn't back and didn't call me the next day, which he'd said he would, I already had some pretty bad feelings about the whole deal. And so it went through that whole day, and finally that night, and my mother-in-law actually called me and said, "Hey, did you see that news flash that came out? Did it come across your phone too? Like, there was a team attacked along the Mali-Niger border." And I already knew after speaking to him that that's where they were headed. So I just was like, that's Brian's team, like Brian's dad. And she was like, no, we don't know that. And I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. And then I pretty much just sat, like my stairs would come down near my front door, and I just sat on my stairs and waited for the knock. I'd called a few people that I knew to call, like, you can call the other wives, you can call like headquarters. But basically, I called the other wives. They'd heard from their husbands. They said things went bad, real bad. And then I tried to call headquarters, and they essentially read from a form stating that they do not give out information until the next of kin have been contacted. And so then I already knew. I went and sat on my steps and basically just waited. And, they came through the door, and I tried to tell them, like, no, I already know. You don't need to say anything. But I think it's because the actual words, that once you hear them, you can't change it or hope for things to be different. It's like the denial
reality sets
longer
in.
exist. Yeah. So the minute they started saying, reading the official, whatever it is, we're sorry, we regret to inform you that, whatever, I don't know that I heard any of the words. It felt like a ton of bricks just were flying at you with each word. So that was kind of how that night went. Fortunately, my kids were already in bed. So I just let them sleep. They were 9 and 11 at the time. And I thought, well, then if I can let them sleep, I can deal with this, because I went instantly into shock. And I figured that out later, because all I know is I drank like 10 gallons of water and stared at the wall for about 4 hours. I don't remember most of the day. I just remember, or night, I remember staring at the wall and trying to figure out how I was going to make enough money to support my kids as a single mom. You're freaking out. So, because you don't know how all that goes. You don't know how much you're actually covered or not covered, what the military is or isn't going to do for you, if your government does anything to support you in the wake of that loss. You don't know anything, because these aren't things that the military really educates spouses on, right? They don't even really educate the average soldier on. And the reality is, there's all sorts of paperwork that the soldier fills out to say, like, hey, this is where basically the money goes if I am killed. And so many soldiers, they'll go in as a single soldier, and then when they get married, they don't. So they will initially sign all that that like if I'm killed in action, all this money goes to my parents or to my siblings. And then they get married and they never transfer that paperwork over. So then the spouse will find out that, hey, my husband was just killed. We were married 10 years ago, but all that paperwork still allots the money to his family. And so now me and the kids are destitute.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that that soldiers just aren't aware of and spouses aren't aware of. Even things like, I always ask Brian, like, well, should we get like, because obviously you're in a dangerous job, like maybe we should get life insurance. Oh, no, I don't need that. If I die, like the military will give you like $1 million. That's not true. And a second insurance policy would have been very helpful. So there's that. And just having a will. Fortunately, he had a will and he had all of his requests laid out, like where he wanted to be buried, what he wanted his, like all his last wishes, which you think like, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want, so morbid. But like, because I was in shock and so incapable at the time of making decisions, it was like we got this paper and it just listed everything he wanted. And it was like, perfect. We don't have to make decisions. We can just like grant his wishes and carry them out. And it took so much off of us. So that's kind of how that went down. And I know I was saying that my kids were asleep when he was killed. So what I did is I waited for the next day because their grandpa was living up in Washington, D.C. at the time. So he drove down to North Carolina and met me. And that way they could have some family around when I told them. So I actually took them to school the next day, didn't tell them anything, and basically informed the school that they would be out until I felt like bringing them back, which ended up being a few months. And then we just took them out into the woods for a walk, and there was a little park out there, and we had a conversation with them. So that's kind of how we did it. But yeah,
it's definitely, it's one of those experiences that, whether you're the service member, whether you're the spouse, whether you're the child, whether you're an extended family member, it's one of those things that you don't ever want to have to experience in the military. But, like you said, you kind of have to think about it because it makes it easier in the end of it, on the family, saying that, okay, this happened. This was very unfortunate, but these are my last wishes. This is what I would have wanted done. And, it's that I'm sure it felt like relief for you guys to be able to say, no, this is exactly what he would have wanted. This is how he would have liked to have it. And, be able to do that for him.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. It was hard, but it would have been 10 times harder if he hadn't written all that out. So
yeah, no, for sure. And it's, we were talking about communities. This is a small community of people who go through this and who experience it. And, that gold star is not something anybody wants, but, it is something that unfortunately people have to carry. And it's about what you make of it and how you go forward, carrying, your loved one's legacy. And, you have done this through many different avenues, including writing a book. So it's, it's important for your story to get out there and other people to know they're not alone, because this is not, unfortunately, probably not going to be the last time we hear of, new Gold Star families being added in. And there are going to be people going through this situation again later on in life. And it's important for them to feel that they're not alone.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
What made you want to write the book? Obviously, getting your story out there, but what made you kind of really want to go that route?
The book was actually something because the Niger ambush was so controversial, and the, I guess, military / government, it depends on the way you look at it, but the highest officials in Africa Command, so AFRICOM, ran an investigation which was very dishonest and lied to the families and the public about what exactly happened. So I didn't really know what the operation was. I didn't know the details. I didn't know why my husband was killed, and they were lying to me. And for me, that was a huge issue, for them to disrespect us that way. And it reminded me a lot. I mean, we hear these stories all the time, right? Like, what Pat Tillman, when he was instantly given a Silver Star, and then his family found out, no, they were trying to cover because it was a friendly fire incident. And just like the Abbey Gate thing where the investigation's basically covering, right? It's covering for higher level people, and we don't know who those are. And for me, it was like my husband's team didn't order themselves out on this mission, and they were supposed to be there and back in a day, but somehow it turned into a almost 3-day mission. How is that? And why is it that now the military is trying to blame the men who were part of the team, were ambushed, shot, and nearly killed, and yet they're somehow at fault for the attack on themselves? But a team doesn't order themselves on these operations. Right. So which officer or which officers were involved, and why is AFRICOM now trying to cover for them? And so that's why I started writing the book. I mean, we had the New York Times, the LA Times, everybody reaching out. They were all writing about it. And everyone was blaming the team captain because that's what AFRICOM was going with. And then I had multiple different news organizations reaching out to me saying, hey, let's interview you. We want to talk to the team. And I was the main link to the team because there were 2 support and 2 Green Berets that were killed. And so to access the Green Beret team that returned, you'd want to speak to one of the widows of a Green Beret. But my husband was the only Green Beret that was married. And so they would try and go through me to access the Green Beret team. And so to access the support, they could access, they could contact the wives from the support team, but I didn't have access to the support team. I had access to the Green Berets. And so they were trying to figure out who was on the ground that day with the team and talk to the actual guys that came back and survived and were now being blamed. And so as I began to speak with them, they told me, one particular person from one of the journalists told me that essentially, I should write the book myself. I should write their story. And so as things kind of snowballed over the course of the year, I spoke with the guys. They started being given letters of reprimand, and they weren't just like put in their local files. There's a couple different types of letters of reprimand. There's a local letter of reprimand, which is kind of like a slap on the wrist. And the minute you move from your say you PCS, that is no longer relevant. But if it's put in your permanent file, then you basically can never be promoted ever again. So it's a way of ending your career without ever basically proving that you did anything wrong. So it'd be kind of like, pulling you over for a traffic ticket and throwing you in jail for the rest of your life, when really you didn't. They have no proof that you did anything wrong. They just want to say that you did. And so that's kind of how the military gets away with ending careers without ending careers. So they were starting to issue permanent letter of reprimands to several men on the team. But when they briefed our family on why they were going to do that, they had no real proof of any wrongdoing and no way they could explain it other than telling me, trust us, Ms. Black. And after several hours of sitting in a room with them, basically talking down to me and telling me that I just needed to trust them, I reached a point where I was pretty irate. And then I thought, okay, well, they're not going to actually follow through with this. And then there was a publicized media brief that they did. And that's when the four-star general over all of AFRICOM stated that all the teams on the continent were performing optimally, but my husband's team was not indicative of what special operators do. And there was no basis for that claim other than he was trying to justify his actions. And it was a huge insult for those who had died. It completely dishonored them. And so in that moment, I realized, okay, these people, these different journalists have said that I should write a book, and I think I'm going to take them seriously. So I spoke to the men who were about to receive all their letters of reprimand, and I was like, you're going to lose your jobs and your careers anyway. So at this point, I know you've been under gag orders. It's going to be the media that comes for you and wants to write a book for you, or it's going to be me, but the media has been destroying you. So are you going to trust them, or are you going to trust me? And they were like, well, you've never written a book. And I was like, well, I'm very, very highly motivated, and I'm more than capable of doing anything if I'm this motivated. And so they were like, okay, we'll let you do it. And so I collected interviews, wrote some articles, ended up getting published in the New York Times and a few other places, and picked up an agent. And within 2 years was signed on with Penguin Random House and published my book not long after that. And it's kind of, the book covers everything from me and Brian to the knock at the door. And then I get deep into the weeds on the investigation. And then I tell the story of what actually happened on the ground, like minute by minute, a full breakdown between which officers were involved ordering them ahead on the mission and what actually happened to the team, which is just mind-boggling, how close they came to death. Because they were at one point hunted through these woods by the terrorists and were in this spot just hiding from them, hoping that they wouldn't be discovered. So anyway, that's the story, and I kind of follow it through with the outcome of awards and, punishments and all of that. But my main goal with it was to not just tell my story, because honestly, I don't think if I was like, as far as the Gold Star thing, I didn't care that much about, like, I lost Brian, but I don't think my story is that unique as far as loss. What I wanted to do was acquit the men on the team before the eyes of the public because they had no one standing up for them. And I knew that as a Gold Star spouse, there was no fallout for me at that point. Like, there was nothing more I could lose. I'd lost my husband. There had been a video of his death put out by ISIS. There were so many things that at that point I was like, what are they going to do? Like, lie to me? They already did that too. So, they're not going to take my money away. And if they do, well, I guess that's just one more thing to write about at this point. So, that's kind of what motivated the story, was at least I'll do something good if the people in this country can see that despite what they've been told by the media, these men are innocent. So.
Yeah. Well, that's huge because, it takes a lot of courage to say, I've already lost enough. Like, there's not much more I can lose, like, let's share this. That, and having some sort of a media background, the media, stories get twisted. Yeah. And, you're never, if it's strictly coming from the media, no matter what news channel you watch, no matter what sources you read, it's going to get twisted, and the truth is never coming out. And it's sad to say that, but that's just how it is. And so having a first account of it and having a first, the point of view of those individuals who are on the ground, those that actually know, it makes a huge difference of, no, this is what really happened and how it went down.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think that was my main interest in writing a book versus doing anything else. You know what I mean? Because I was approached about doing, other things, as far as media involvement. And I just went, why? Because everything will get lost in that. With a book, you can clearly line out your research, write it down, and it's permanent. And there is no twisting of that. And so for me, that made more sense, even if people don't read as often now. I mean, fortunately, there's audiobooks. So I was like, if we can do an audiobook, then that's good enough.
It reads word for word.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the last thing I want to ask you is, what piece of advice would you give to another military spouse?
Gosh, I guess, the most important thing is be prepared for everything, and anything. But, I think through just being in the military, being a military spouse, I mean, that's why, it's be prepared for anything and everything, right? Because you need to make sure that you have those things, that your husband has, or your spouse or whatever, your wife has made sure that the paperwork is lined out, that you know what their wishes are. All of those things matter more than you would think. And you may say, oh, this will never happen to us. Believe me, I did up until the day it happened. But it'll give you that sense of peace. And everything else just comes. I mean, the strength to be a military spouse, it happens as you live that lifestyle. It just does. So yeah, make sure wherever you go, you make a good group of friends and you get that paperwork handled.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for not only coming on the podcast and sharing your story here, but for sharing your story, on so many other different avenues, and for, actually standing up and not, I'm sure it could have been so easy to kind of close in, after all you've been through. And it takes a lot of courage and strength to do what you've done. And so thank you for doing that as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it was my pleasure. And I think one thing we always fear, especially being a spouse of someone who's enlisted, is we always think like, well, what's going to happen if I do step out and do this? And I'll tell you one thing is, in the aftermath, I did make a lot of enemies, a lot of powerful enemies, but I also made a lot of probably even more powerful friends. And not everyone in the military, all the way up to 4-star generals, are going to hate you for speaking the truth. A lot of them are standing there waiting for someone to do it. And they're very grateful for those who do. So I've made a lot of good friends at high levels just because I said what they couldn't. And a lot of them wanted to say it, but they can't without losing their careers.
Yeah. No, I totally understand that. And, it's hard. And it's hard to do that. But, we all need somebody who is willing to speak up. And that first person who's willing to speak up. Because once that first person, it's like domino effect. Everything else starts to come out with it.
Yeah, it really does. So,
yes. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me. I really had a good time.
Thank you for listening to Grace of a Military Child and Life podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to give it a like, follow, and comment. Also, be sure to check out Instagram and Facebook at Grace of a Military Child and Life for more awesome content. For information on the podcast, Military Child Bigs and Littles, GoAMCL blog, or other resources, visit www.goamcl.org. You can also email me at Gracie, that's GRACIE @GOAMCL.org, with any questions or comments. To be a guest on the podcast, you can schedule it at www.goamcl.org/schedule a podcast, all one word, or contact me via social media or email. Stay tuned for the next episode where another incredible story is shared.